I bought the laptop off a local resale site because it was cheap and I only needed it for basic work, spreadsheets and email, nothing serious, and when I picked it up the seller told me he'd wiped it but didn't seem like the most tech-savvy guy, so I wasn't surprised when I turned it on at home and saw a generic user profile still sitting there. I figured I'd reset it later, but curiosity got the better of me and I clicked around first, mostly to make sure it functioned properly. That's when I noticed a folder on the desktop simply labeled Backup. Inside were dozens of subfolders with dates as names, stretching back about 6 months. I almost deleted them immediately, assuming they were personal files, but something made me open one. The first photo loaded slowly, and at first my brain didn't register what I was looking at. It was a picture of a small blue house with white trim and a narrow driveway. It took me a full 3 seconds to realize I was staring at my own house. The angle was from across the street, slightly to the left, like someone standing near the neighbor's mailbox. I actually laughed once, confused, and muttered that it had to be a coincidence because lots of houses look similar. Then I clicked the next photo. It was my house again, this time taken at night. My living room lights were on. You could see the shadow of me moving inside through the curtains. I felt the back of my neck go cold. I clicked through more images. Different days. Different times. Morning shots of my car in the driveway. Afternoon pictures of packages sitting on my porch. A close-up zoom of my front door. The dates and the folder names matched the timestamps embedded in the images, and they were recent, some from just 2 weeks ago. I checked the laptop's system info. The previous user account had a name that didn't match the seller's profile name. I went back to the listing and reread it carefully. The seller had claimed he was helping his cousin get rid of old electronics. My hands felt slightly numb as I opened another folder. This one wasn't outside photos. It was taken from inside a vehicle parked down the street. I recognized the cracked sidewalk and the small tree in front of my yard. One photo showed my bedroom window late at night. The curtains were partially open. I could see the glow of my TV. There were hundreds of images, organized neatly by date, like someone documenting a project. I shut the laptop and just sat there listening to the hum of my refrigerator, trying to make sense of how this machine had ended up in my hands. Either the seller had taken the photos himself and accidentally sold the evidence, or he'd bought it from someone else without checking what was on it. I opened it again and checked the most recent folder. The last photo had been taken 3 days before I bought the laptop. It was a daytime shot of my house. I was in the driveway, loading groceries into my trunk. The image was clear enough to see my face if you zoomed in. After that, there were no new photos. I looked at the laptop's Wi-Fi history and saw that it had connected recently to a network with a generic name I didn't recognize. Then I noticed something else. In the browser bookmarks bar was a saved link labeled with my street name. It wasn't a website. It was a GPS pin dropped on a map, centered exactly on my address. I reported everything to the police that night and handed over the laptop. They told me not to jump to conclusions, that it could be a coincidence, that maybe the previous owner lived nearby and had some harmless reason for the photos. But when an officer drove me home after I gave my statement, he slowed slightly as we approached my street and said quietly that the angle of the shot suggested they were taken from inside a parked car that had likely been sitting there for extended periods. For the past year, I had occasionally noticed the same dark sedan parked down the block, assuming it belonged to a neighbor. I never paid attention to who was inside. I still don't know whether the seller was involved or whether he unknowingly passed along someone else's obsession, but I do know that since the police took the laptop, that dark sedan hasn't appeared on my street again, and I can't decide if that makes me feel safer or more aware that whoever was watching now knows I've seen what they left behind. The first time I heard it, I was in the cereal aisle at the grocery store. Clear as anything, just over my shoulder, Maya. Not shouted, not whispered, just spoken in a normal voice like someone trying to get my attention without making a scene. I turned immediately, expecting to see a coworker or maybe someone from my apartment building, but there was no one behind me except an elderly man comparing oatmeal brands. He didn't even look up. I stood there for a second, embarrassed at how fast I'd reacted, then told myself I must have misheard something, maybe a child saying, "Mom," maybe my brain filling in gaps the way it sometimes does with half-heard sounds. I brushed it off and went home. The second time was 3 days later at a coffee shop. I was waiting for my order when I heard it again, closer this time, right near my ear, "Maya." I actually felt the breath of it, or at least I thought I did, that subtle shift in air that makes you turn instinctively. I spun around so quickly I almost bumped into the barista, but no one was standing near me. The people behind me were absorbed in their phones. No one was looking at me, no one smiling like it was a prank. I left without my drink. After that, it started happening everywhere, on the train platform, in the produce section of another store, once while walking past a crowded park. Always my name, always spoken normally, always from just behind me, and every time I turned, there was no one there who could have said it. I began testing it. When I heard it, I wouldn't turn right away. I'd wait, listening for footsteps or laughter or the sound of someone calling again. Nothing. Just the regular hum of public spaces. I told myself it was stress. I'd been sleeping badly, working too much. But then it happened in a way I couldn't rationalize. I was sitting in a nearly empty library one afternoon, headphones in, reading. The room was quiet enough that you could hear pages turning. Over my music, faint but unmistakable, I heard it again, "Maya." I froze. I paused my audio slowly and looked up without moving my head much. Across the room, a man was sitting at a table facing me. He wasn't looking down at a book. He was looking directly at me. Not surprised that I'd looked up. Not confused. Just watching, like he'd been waiting for me to react. I felt my pulse start to pound in my throat. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just held my gaze for a few seconds too long before calmly looking back down at his laptop. I packed my things and left immediately. Over the next week, I started noticing him more often. On the opposite side of the subway platform. Standing near the entrance of a store I just exited. Always at a distance. Always alone. He never approached me, never spoke again where I could see his lips move, but I kept hearing my name in public spaces, always when I couldn't immediately spot him. I finally went to the police, feeling ridiculous as I explained that someone might be following me but hadn't actually done anything except possibly say my name. An officer suggested it could be anxiety, auditory misperception, that sometimes in crowded environments our brains misinterpret random sounds as familiar words. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But last night, as I was unlocking my apartment door after work, I heard it again, directly behind me in the hallway, "Maya." I didn't turn this time. I just kept my eyes forward and slowly stepped inside, locking the door carefully. Through the peephole, a few seconds later, I saw him standing at the far end of the hallway, looking at my door, as if confirming I had heard him. We found the keys in the junk drawer, which is what made it worse, because that drawer is where everything random ends up, batteries, old receipts, spare change, so at first I assumed they were ours and I'd just forgotten about them. But when I picked up the small silver keyring and looked closer, I realized there were 3 keys on it that matched the exact shape of our front door, back door, and garage keys, and the cuts along the metal were fresh and sharp like they'd just been copied, and I remember calling out to my wife from the living room asking if she'd made spare keys recently, and she walked in wiping her hands on a towel and immediately shook her head before I even finished the question, because we had only ever made 2 full sets when we moved in, one for each of us, and we'd agreed not to give extras to anyone after a bad experience at our old apartment. I laid both of our keyrings on the counter and compared them side by side with the new set, and they were identical down to the brand stamp near the bow of the key, which meant someone hadn't just found old copies, they'd deliberately duplicated ours. We stood there in silence for a long moment trying to think of a reasonable explanation, like maybe the previous owners had left a spare set hidden somewhere and we were only now finding it, except we had replaced all the locks the week we moved in, and I distinctly remembered handing the locksmith every original key to destroy. The longer we stared at the extra set, the more the air in the kitchen felt wrong, like the room had quietly shifted around us. My wife asked if maybe I'd had copies made and forgotten, which irritated me more than it should have, because I would never do that without telling her, and besides, the keys were on a plain keyring we didn't recognize, not the hardware store tag they usually come with. That night neither of us slept well, and around 3 a.m. I got up to double-check the doors, only to notice something subtle but deeply unsettling. The deadbolt on the back door felt smoother than usual when I turned it, like it had been used recently, even though we hadn't opened that door all day. The next morning I decided to test something. I took the unknown keys and, without telling my wife, tried them in the front door lock. The key slid in perfectly and turned without resistance. The lock opened. My stomach dropped so fast I felt dizzy. Whoever made these hadn't guessed. They had direct access. We called a locksmith immediately, and when he arrived, he asked how many copies we'd had made since installing the new locks. When we told him just 2, he frowned and explained that the type of key we had could only be duplicated with the original present unless someone had physical access to it long enough to trace it carefully. That meant someone had either borrowed our keys without us noticing or been inside the house long enough to take an impression. As he removed the front door lock, he paused and held it closer to the light, then pointed out faint scratch marks around the keyhole, tiny, circular abrasions consistent with someone using the lock frequently but gently, not forcing it, just entering and exiting over time. We went through the house that afternoon more carefully than we ever had before and found small things we couldn't explain away anymore. A pair of shoes in the closet shifted slightly from where I always leave them, a dining chair not perfectly aligned with the table, a window in the laundry room unlocked even though we both swear we always latch it. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just the quiet evidence of someone treating our home like it was also theirs. The police took a report but said without cameras or visible damage there wasn't much they could do. We changed every lock that day, installed security cameras, and set alarms on the windows. A week later, just as we were starting to relax, we opened the junk drawer to grab a flashlight during a power outage and found it there again, another identical set of keys resting neatly on top of the batteries. No note, no explanation, just the silent reminder that someone, somewhere, could still make their way inside whenever they wanted.